Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 6th week of the spring 2018 semester. So this week we bid adieu to the Romantic period, and we enter the Victorian period, which means we bid adieu to the Romantic textbook, and we now start this one, the Victorian textbook, so the second of the three in our set. So, what about this week? First of all, I want to say that I looked at the Romanticism exam scores. You all did very well. Everybody passed, so I was pleased with that. I also graded all the quizzes up through last week's quiz. I regret that I've not been able to find the time to get the postings read, but I will do that later this week. I think there are some openings this week that I can get in there and get that done. So you'll have a more accurate picture of where you stand in this class. And I think it's only fair to you that you do have a more accurate picture of how you're doing in this class, and I find it unacceptable to myself that I've not graded those postings yet. But I will get to those very shortly. All right, so the Victorian period. That is my specialty. That is why I became a British literature specialist, was for the Victorian period. And you've got the Victorian introduction, which is required reading, and a lot of your quiz for this week will come from that, as well as the slideshow, the PowerPoint slideshow in the week 6 module. But I also think it's very fitting that we open up the Victorian period with the poet that is considered the greatest of the Victorian poets by many scholars, and that is Alfred Lord Tennyson. Alfred Lord Tennyson was a celebrity in his lifetime. He knew the Queen very well. You're going to find as you do this research that Queen Victoria is the person that the Victorian period is named after. She, up until about a year and a half or so ago, had been the longest reigning monarch in English history, which is odd because when she was born, she was like fourth in line for the throne. And as it turned out, she ascended to the throne thanks to the deaths of the people ahead of her, and she ruled for 61 years and a few months after that. So, needless to say, this time period that's named after her is fittingly named because she ruled for so long, and she put her stamp on England, and the 60, 61, 62 years that she reigned as the Queen of England was a time of great change in English history. It was during the peak of the Industrial Revolution. It was during the peak of British imperialism. It was during the peak of the wars between the Church of England and others, while Protestantism was going on and so on and so forth. And she was the ruler over all of it. During her time, as you're going to see as we go through these Victorian lectures, the position of women changed quite greatly, and the position of minorities changed a little bit as well. And you're going to see some of that as we go through. So, that's the introduction to the Victorian period. Now, if anybody wants to ask who was the greatest poet of the Victorian era, you will probably hear from many scholars, if not all of them, Alfred Lord Tennyson. He was iconic during his lifetime, and even now, many years after his death. How iconic was he? He replaced William Wordsworth, the poet we started this semester with, as poet laureate when Wordsworth died in 1850. Alfred Lord Tennyson stepped into that role and held it for 42 years. No poet laureate in the history of British poetry has ever held that post longer. Not before him, not since him. And there are many ways we could go with this. If you've ever heard the expression, it's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all, that was Alfred Lord Tennyson. He wrote that in his iconic poem In Memoriam, which I'm not having you read because it's too long, it's too complicated, and it's about the love he felt for another man. Not a romantic love, and certainly not a sexual love, but a friendship kind of love. That was very intense. Now, by the way, Alfred Lord Tennyson did marry a woman, and she gave him 3 sons, and by all accounts, it was a very happy marriage. So, there's that. As you read the 2 poems that I've assigned for you by Alfred Lord Tennyson, Ulysses and The Lady of Shalott, notice how he actually plays upon mythology. Notice how he pulls his story ideas from existing stories. The King Arthur story and Homer's Ulysses. Or I'm sorry, Homer's Odyssey. Where Ulysses, who is a hero of the Odyssey, sometimes called Odysseus. In Ulysses, he gets home, he's had 20 years of adventures, he's come home to his wife, who is now no longer as young and pretty as she used to be. His son is a grown man and is practically running the kingdom anyway. He came home to a bunch of men who were eating all of his crops and killing all of his livestock and living on his land and destroying it. And then once he vanquishes all those foes, he spends his life being a judge, where he sits on his throne and he decides this person's right or that person's right. And he finds that a very unsatisfying life. So according to Tennyson, who is carrying on the Ulysses story, Ulysses decides to go back out on the sea and to never return to Ithaca again. And he turns control of the kingdom over to Telemachus, his own son. Take note of how this is a dramatic monologue. We will see this again whenever we read Robert Browning, which will be pretty soon. Then there is the Lady of Shalott. The Lady of Shalott is going to fall in love with an Arthurian hero by the name of Sir Lancelot. You've probably heard of Lancelot. The Lady of Shalott is both a metaphor for a woman's loss of innocence and a metaphor for the dangers of gaining knowledge. And you'll see what I mean when the Lady of Shalott dies as a result of leaving her castle, leaving her little safe place, leaving essentially innocence and childhood behind. And you'll see how that works out as you read the poem. So think about those things as you read the Tennyson postings this week, or poems this week. So that's all I have. I've kept taking enough of your time, but I do hope that you will find this Victorian period as enjoyable as I do. I love the Victorian period. I have a passion for it, and I really can't wait to see how many students end up sharing that same love for the period that I have by the time we get finished with this section of the semester.